Good morning and welcome. I know there's still a few people coming in the door, but we'll get the welcome out of the way and then we'll have our main speaker. I want to thank the City of Fridley for offering us this space. It's a beautiful day outside. I hope you all were able to find semi-close parking. They have another event going on today, so we're sharing the parking spaces. There's bathrooms right outside the doors on the right-hand side there if you need to get up and use those. We're going to hold all questions and answers until the very end today. We have two speakers. We have our main speaker who's going to talk for about an hour, and then we have a second speaker from Alina EMS with us today too. So I will, without further ado, introduce Dr. Dave Matthews. He has more than 35 years of experience working with families, adolescents, and children related to the issues of trauma. He's currently a therapist at People Incorporated Family Life Mental Health Center. He's been in part-time private practice as a therapist for 27 years with youth, families, and groups. He provides training and consultation nationally and internationally on the topics of trauma, secondary trauma, and violence prevention. He has been a community facilitator or faculty at Metro State University of Minnesota for more than 10 years. He has led and participated in multiple agency systems and community initiatives that address issues of trauma, violence, and violence prevention. Welcome, Dr. Matthews.
Thank you for taking time out of your day and being able to be here. This is the best place for you to be right now at this time. All right. I'm big on transitions. I'm big on paying attention to moving from out there to in here, all right? And to give ourselves some time, just a moment, just to kind of give ourselves a space from out there to in here. And as you'll hear me talk about, it's very important that we have some of our own self-reflection and we pay attention to and have some self-awareness, both about what brings us here, what we're hoping to get out of here, but also just kind of the other things that might be also part of what's going on in our brains. So just giving ourselves just a few seconds to kind of make that transition in, all right? Give us about 5 seconds. So, my name is Dave Matthews, not that Dave Matthews. And it's become more and more of a dangerous kind of statement for me to make because sometimes I'm speaking to students, younger folks who don't remember or don't know who Dave Matthews is. He's got 2 T's, I've got 1 T in my last name, so that's a way that you can remember our differences. I'm again just really thrilled to be able to offer you some time to kind of focus on this particular issue of secondary trauma and thinking about what that is and how that affects us. How that affects us as professionals, how that affects how we do our work, how it affects our lives, all right? So again, another kind of transition kind of piece for me is about being able to take that breath, right? Being able to take it in and let it out, all right? So being able to pay attention to these pieces is really important to me, and we'll get to some of that. But before we get to any further into this, there's a way that I usually do introductions and introductions of you all to me as well. And this is an activity. One of the things you're going to have to deal with me is that I'm a group worker by training. And so group workers are a kind of strange breed. We're kind of like these border collies that like to get things into groups, right? And see what happens. So one of the activities that I learned from a friend of mine who did a lot of trainings, he talked about his work working with the Maori people of New Zealand. And they have 2 ways to greet each other, to meet each other, if they haven't ever met before. And the first way is they put their noses and their foreheads together, and they move their heads back and forth. We're not doing that part, all right? So no worries. And also no role plays today. So breathe, right? All right. But what I am going to ask you to do is to participate by, even if you know the person, you've worked with the person for many years, or the person is somebody that you've just met today, I'm going to ask you to just to turn to one other person near you, all right? And if it's a group of 3, that's fine. You're just going to have to be faster, all right? And I'm going to ask you to share 5 things, one person at a time, to share 5 things. First, your first name. Hopefully that's not hard. Second thing is to share who is your tribe today. What group do you connect with? What group do you feel some sort of affiliation to? This could be your because of your family name. It could be a group that you from your community. It could be a community name. It could be your basketball league name or your volleyball team league name. But some group that you feel some sort of affinity to is wherever that is for you today at this moment. And then what is share what your land is. My land is whatever space, it could be where you live, the street you live on, the city you live in. It could be the place where you grew up. Your land could be your 1 by 1 foot square that you stand on at any given moment. It could be someplace you vacation. But some sort of connection that you have to some land that is true for you today. And then third, I'd like you to, fourth, I'd like you to share what your water is. And that is any particular body of water, any sort of lake, stream, ocean, drinking, bathtub, water, whatever connects for you as far as what your water is today. And then finally, I want you to share what your mountains are today. And, you know, of course, if you've lived any longer than 15 minutes in Minnesota, we have no mountains in Minnesota. But it doesn't matter whether it's a mountain or whether it's a hill or whether it's a rise. Nobody's going to check, right? But some sort of mountain that you feel some sort of kinship with, that you've visited, that you grew up around, that you vacationed at, that you've seen in National Geographic perhaps. Something that connects for you as far as being that mountain. And it could be a figurative mountain. Perhaps it's the mountain of work that you have waiting for you back at work. Perhaps it's the mountain of caseload that you have. But some sort of mountain that for you fits today, that you feel connected to. And so when you go through those 5 pieces of information, the person that you're doing this with will respond with, I hear, and your first name. All right? And then you will go and say those 5 things, and that person will respond with, I hear, and your first name. You got 30 seconds for both of you to do this. Ready, set, go. All right, the other person should be going about now. Very good. All right, I'm going to ask you to come back to the center here. Ask you to come back. Oh, I know it's tempting. It's tempting to go on. I got it. All right. So usually when I do this, I do it in much smaller groups, or I do it in a more controlled classroom where we have time to go around and everybody shares all their information, and it's a wonderful time. But we really don't have, of course, that much time today. But what I would like to do is to ask 3 or 4 of you to share your first name and one of these other 4 things, and then the rest of us will respond with I hear and that person's first name. So is there 1 or 2 or 3 of you that would be willing to say your first name and one of these other things that you connect with? Yeah.
My name is Jamie, and my mountain is Big Sky, Montana.
I hear Jamie. Oh, come on, let's do it all. I hear Jamie. Thank you, Jamie. Somebody else? Come on, this.
My name is Jess, and my land is the great state of Minnesota.
I hear Jess. Very good. One more person. Come on. Yes, sir.
My name is Paul, and my water is Lake Superior.
I hear Paul. Very nice. My name is Dave. My tribe is Acosta. My land is Maplewood. My water is from Minnesota. How can it not be Lake Superior? However, I fell in love with Lake Michigan a few years ago, and There's some places there that I just love to get back to. And my mountains are this hill that I grew up around in the northern suburbs of St. Paul, where I was able to kind of when I was a kid, I was able to get away from everything and just kind of think. Thank you very much. Now, besides being just kind of a different way to start out introductions and to kind of you getting to know each other a little better, me to get a little bit more sense of things going on with you all, there is a purpose behind that, and you'll hear more specifically about what that is in just a few minutes in terms of how, and you'll hear me harp on this a lot today, it's about self-care, all right? It's about self-care. You know, if you want to know the number one thing that I'm going to be suggesting today about how to, if we're experiencing some sort of secondary trauma, which I think we've all been exposed to some degree, right? That in our work, at least in our work, if not even personally, that we need to look at a primary way of taking care of ourselves as a way to address those things. All right. So, but I'll come back to this in terms of hopefully tying this into what the whole thing is about around secondary trauma. So, now I'd like to take another kind of survey here. All right. So, please raise your hand. Oh, maybe not. There it is. How many of you have a friend or family member who has experienced a trauma, or you personally have experienced some sort of trauma or high stress in your life? Okay, very good. We're all in good company, right? Okay, very good. How many of you currently work with or have some association with people in your life who have experienced trauma? Look at that. Wow. Thank you. And then how many of you have worked for more than 1 year in the field of helping others who have experienced some sort of trauma? Okay? How many have worked for 5 years or more? How many have worked for 10 years or more? Okay, and you all are like, started probably when you were about 15, right? Okay? Like me. All right. So, I mean, I want to honor that. I want to honor the experience that you all have. You all have a tremendous amount of understanding about the issues of trauma. You understand live. You understand exactly what it is to be face-to-face with having to hear somebody else's trauma, as well as likely your own experiences with it personally, whether it's with friends or yourselves. So I find it to be important, not just to kind of have us fun to see who's been here, who's old and who's not, but also to be able to understand that we have a lot of years in this room, probably hundreds of years, if not thousands, of experience, and that is worth honoring. And to know that and for those of you who've only been involved in a short amount of time in the field, you have some other mentors, hopefully, and people that can be helpful to you in your process here. Oh, I also have how many have worked for 20 or more years? Can I see anybody? 20 more? A couple? A few? All right. And again, we started out when we were 5 or 6, I guess, huh? Okay. So what do you want to gain from this session? So I had a couple of ideas and what the goals were or the objectives were as we talked, and I talked with the committee that helped to bring me here. Better understand of what secondary trauma is, how to identify it and its causes, increase the understanding of what trauma-informed care is. Has anybody heard that term, being trauma-informed? Some people have, many people have, okay? It's kind of a buzzword these days, right? And can't write a grant unless you have some sort of term about being trauma-informed in there, right? All right, and what is self-care strategy? What are the self-care strategies and tools? What are some of them for preventing and addressing secondary trauma? And then there's probably other things and reasons that you're here. Perhaps it's to get away from the phone. Perhaps it's to kind of have a space, just kind of not to have to deal with the pressures of being at work. What other things are you hoping to get out of today? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Any other kind of pieces that might be in addition to this or want to emphasize the things that I already said? Yeah.
I think for me, just a better understanding so I can better serve the people I assist.
A better understanding to be able to serve the people that you work with, right? Good, nice. Yeah.
I'm very interested in self-care strategies for teachers at Anoka County Schools.
Self-care strategies for teachers. Yes, absolutely. Good. Anybody else? Yeah. Pardon me? For bus drivers? For bus drivers? Right? Okay. Anybody in the school system. Everybody else. Exactly. I love it. That's perfect. Well, that's very helpful. And I think I got stuff. I hope I got stuff that will be very practical and we'll be able to get to, and hopefully very soon. All right? Before we get into all the material, and as actually we'll get into the material as I talk about these three things, because I really believe, as I said from the onset, these three elements are very foundational to our understanding of what trauma is, as well as how it affects us, and how it affects the people we work with, and then how it affects us in the work that we do. So we need to have some self-reflections personally, professionally, and understand internally how those self-reflections affect us, the self-awareness, as well as have some understanding of what perspectives are. Self-reflection really is for me, is about honoring, what is so for you right now, right here. As I said, transitions are important to me, to pay attention to transitions. The people that we work with, I'm going to kind of go back and forth, the people that we work with and paying attention to our own stuff, okay? So the people that we work with who are traumatized, transitions are a very important thing. For kids, transitions are an important thing. Going from the classroom into the bus, all right? Going from the bus in the morning into the classroom, and then passing through the house. All those are different transitions for kids in terms of trying to figure out, I have to act differently in all those different places, right? I have to have it, and sometimes for kids, they even have a different role in each of those places. And so that's a lot of stress on kids. And trying to kind of navigate through all that is sometimes difficult. But what we need to do is to honor what is so for us right now, what is happening inside of us, and that's the self-reflection piece. There's also, you'll see a little further down the list. Oh, by the way, the slides that you see here are accessible, all right? They will be accessible and they'll be on the site, on the committee site. So you'll be able to access these and get back to them, okay? As you look down the list here in terms of things about self-reflection, you'll see one epic moment and one compassionate engagement. Those are some self-reflection pieces that are important as far as tools to have, and I'll talk more about what epic moments are about, what self-compassion engagements are about, paying attention to those times when you felt some compassion, either towards you or you've sensed the compassion that's gone on between others in those moments, all right? And try to reflect on some of those moments, not just the negative, terrible, awful trauma pieces that we've experienced in our lives, but some of those compassionate moments that really bring about a way that we can cope, right? When we're in the midst of experiencing trauma, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but when somebody shares their trauma with you, it becomes your trauma, right? When somebody shares their trauma with you, it becomes your trauma. And so paying attention to yourself then, in addition to paying attention to yourself and having self-reflection is something that's going to be helpful so that you can be there for the person that you want to help, all right? The other piece is about self-awareness and understanding those training experiences. How many have ever been to a trauma-informed training? Being trauma-informed. How many have ever been to a class or been to where you've talked about trauma or the experiences of trauma, all right? So, and likely, again, those of us who've been around for a little longer, since we've been 5 or 6, we've had a lot of those trainings over the years, right? And particularly about how we do it to other people, how we provide that trauma-informed care to other people. This is about providing it for ourselves, right? This is about understanding that if you're going to be trauma-informed, if your company, if your agency, if your district is really talking the talk, if they're saying they're providing trauma-informed care, a part of trauma-informed care is about what is the self-care for the professionals involved, right? It's about establishing a regular, some sort of element that is actually ingrained within the overall system that takes care of its employees, but also supports employees for moving towards getting some sort of ways of applying self-care. But self-awareness, this is about understanding what are all those trainings that you've had, what are all those things that that have helped define how you look at what trauma is, how you look at what secondary trauma is. So it's paying attention to those things that might be there and of course some of those things brought you here today. At the very base of that self-awareness is understanding and having some thought about what is your theory of change. When you're working with somebody who's been traumatized, having an understanding already of, okay, here's what I believe helps in terms of making change with people who have been traumatized. And so having that theory of change is an important element to have as your base understanding of how you address even secondary trauma. And then the second question is, what are the theoretical underpinnings of that? You know, what are the methods that I use to be able to help that change to go about that fit with that theory, all right? And for me, this is my kind of, it doesn't look brief, but it is my brief way of kind of describing my theory of change, and then it's based on those kind of theories and those kinds of approaches, and then my long statement about that theory of change that I have. And if you'll notice that while there's a lot of words up there, probably the most important part of that theory of change is the last word. It's about relationship, right? Quite frankly, what we know about, what we know in the research is that you can use any of those theories. You can be wed to one of them or a multiple of them, and really what really makes the difference in terms of change is the relationship. You know? So, but knowing what it is and having a sense of your base is really an important part of your self-awareness, all right? And it all intermixes, and your approach and your theory and shapes how I do trauma-informed care. The third and last piece of the foundational thing to understand about before we get into secondary trauma is about understanding perspectives. Everybody's got one, right? Everybody's got a different way of looking at things. Well, here's your test for today, all right, for the first test for today, okay? In this figure that's coming up on screen, how many squares do you see? Too many to count. Everybody's too stressed. Oh, my bad. Sorry, I pressed the button there. How many? Everybody's too stressed out to count, okay? How many? Any guesses? 22. 23. Way more than that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, what happens here? What's going on here? Okay. There happens to be 30 squares in this figure. All right? So everybody sees the 16. You with me on that? Okay. All right. And then where's another one? The 2 by 2s in each of the quadrants, right? That's 20. The big one. Okay, Courtney. Help me out here, huh? Yeah. I'm pushing buttons, you're pushing buttons, okay. All right, there we go, okay. Stay. Oh, you're okay, Evie. All right. So we got 20 squares. What else? 21, the big one.
The middle.
The 2 by 2s in the middle, 22. Oh, very good. Those are usually the hardest. The 3 by 3s in each of the corners, okay? That's 26. And then if you look at the 2 by 2s and that make kind of a cross, the up and down ones here, all right? So are there 16 squares in that figure? Yes. Are there 21 squares in that figure? It happens to be a total of 30, right? It just depends on your perspective, right? So here's some other pieces about perspective. Is this circle perfectly round and is this square perfectly square? The answer is yes to both of those questions. But what affects how you look at that circle and how you look at that square? What affects it? The other, what? The outside forces, the other things going on around it, right? So this is an understanding about perspective that in order to really see what we're trying to look at, we need to understand the context of what's going on around what's happening here, right? Okay, oops, I went backwards. I didn't want to do that. Okay, now is this a cube with a cube part missing or a cube with a cube sticking out from the corner? Which is it? Both, right? Simultaneous truths, both. We got a timing thing going on here, right? Okay, so simultaneous truths, both are true at the same time. It's both happening. Now, for us that are 27 or 28 years or older, Our brains can't function with simultaneous truths. We come to a point where we have to kind of make a decision. Is it this or is it that, right? Whereas younger brains, developing brains, youth brains that are like youth age, like 0 to 27, 28, I'm sorry, it's a brain development thing, sorry. But what it is that they have the capacity to have simultaneous truths going on. They can believe very strongly with this one thing and very strongly this one thing. They're almost opposites, and yet they have the capacity to hold them true at the same time. And there was a book out once, and I talked to parents a lot about dealing with their kids. And one of the books that was out a long time ago, I think it's in its 12th or 13th edition now, it's I Hate You, Mom, but can you take Cheryl and me to the mall? Right? It's that simultaneous belief, that happens. Kids, youth have that capacity. We have a tendency to not, we come up to this cognitive dissonance thing that happens where we have to kind of make a decision. Otherwise, we just can't, it's harder to function. It causes stress. Okay, now you're going to control it now, Courtney? Thank you. Now, is this a duck or? Push button. A rabbit. Which is it? It's kind of, well, it's kind of both, all right? But when you put a duck and a rabbit together, they don't make this, right? You're with me on that, okay? We all know our biology enough about that, okay? But if you look at it one way as if it were looking that way, like that one, you might see the duck. And if you change your perspective and see it looking that way, you might see that it could be a rabbit, all right? It's the same, it's both, but not at the same time, right? Not like the cubes. Please? Now, I have twin boys. They're the most amazing boys on the face of this earth, and they are now they're twins now, 23 years old, and they're just amazing. But I've had to put them through, of course, they've had to endure my putting them through these kinds of quizzes and tests over their lifetimes. And a long time ago, one of my boys, Lucas, I said, Luke, are these birds or are they rabbits? And before I missed a beat, he said, well, look, Dad, it's a rabbit looking at a bird. I had my agenda, right? I had my perspective. I had my belief. Here are the two choices, and what does he do? He comes up with a third choice, right? Okay. So perspective is very important, and perspective always has a story, and this is where it ties into our understanding of trauma, because people's trauma stories affect us. People's trauma stories are stories. They're their perspective. They're how they look at things. So if you were to arrange these pictures to tell a story, some people pick the straight line to start out their story in terms of telling a story using these boxes. Some people start out with the dotted lines that help to start their story. Some people will start with the top right one that helps to start them tell their story. Then it becomes more complex when we start using images in terms of telling stories. And these stories then can be more complex because now we have these images that mean different things to each of us. And so some people end their story with a heart or with a smiley face, right? And then what makes things even more complex is language. And when we put language to the stories, perspective becomes even more interesting, challenging, if you will, because now everybody has a different way of looking at the different groups of words and understanding of what those words mean to us, and they elicit some sort of different emotional response for some of us, and if we were to make a story out of these particular boxes. But sometimes we ask the wrong questions. Sometimes we ask the questions, whose story is more correct? Because we kind of get into this investigative mode. We kind of want to know who's telling the truth here, right? And I would suggest that when people are sharing their traumas with us, and when we're sharing our traumas with other people, it's not about whether it's true or not true. It's about, tell me about your story. Because we're more collectors of stories than we are really about trying to decide which one is more factual or more true, right? So the better questions are, what differences and similarities do you see in the stories being told, right? And then one of the questions that I'll kind of harp on again too in a moment is my focus when I'm working with folks who've been traumatized is not about what's wrong with you. It's about what happened to you. It's about collecting their story, helping me to understand what brings you to that point of making those decisions that you made, all right? That helps me to help you. So, we have the better questions, we have the highlights that I just talked about. So in terms of the three components of trauma-informed care that I'm going to use, because that's at the base if you look at the self-care piece. It's about having the knowledge, the information about how does it function, how does trauma affect our brains, how does it affect our developmental process, how does it affect and influence our behavior today. For us to have that knowledge, that's one of the sides of being trauma-informed in terms of providing care. The second side is having the information about conceptualizing and assessing and implementing that information with the people we're working with, right? If you're providing trauma-informed care, it's not just knowing how the brain works when it's all muddled up with experiences of trauma. It's also understanding how do you then apply this in the work that you're doing directly with the people that you're working with? How do you conceptualize your understanding of their issues when you're talking with that person and hearing that person's story? And then how do you apply that information to help them to develop the tools that they need? Just like we're talking about in terms of the tools that we can use. And they're very similar, they're very exact, almost exactly alike in terms of the tools we're providing them, that I'm going to suggest that we think about how do we apply this to ourselves, all right? So that's that second leg, which then brings us to that third part of providing trauma-informed care, and that is about professional self-care, self-reflection, self-awareness, mindfulness, self-regulation, and then the self-care itself. And having a self-care plan that has maintenance as well as in-the-moment options. When you're feeling stressed out in the moment, what do you do? How do you take care of yourself in that moment? Is an important element to have set up for yourself. Thank you. I take a very public health approach to thinking about this issue, and in public health, what we know is there are three questions that we often ask, and that is, what is it, what causes it, and how do I prevent it or address it, all right? So what is it is the first one, which is about defining it, what causes it, what's the etiology, what are the beginnings of what trauma is, right, and where does it come from? And then how do I prevent it or how do I address it, right? And there's hopefully some clues to that as we go along here. So defining trauma. We're going to define trauma, stress, and then secondary trauma, stress, all right? Because those are the three elements that we're talking about. And all of these things affect us. All of these things are things that we're coming back to when we're talking about the actual application of things for ourselves to deal with the secondary trauma. So these are multiple ways of looking at trauma, of defining trauma. There's no one perfect way to define trauma, all right? Some of them might fit for you a little better than some others. The one that I tend to lean more towards is any experience, the first one, perceived or real loss, transition, or stress having a significant and negative impact, all right? That's not I don't think I have the one from the APA version of life when it comes to trauma on this particular slide, but they have their own kind of version of things. Again, understanding for us to have some sort of definition for ourselves, okay, that's the important part. The other one that I like is that essentially that it's any experience that action or event that is a concussion to one's soul, right? Somehow it has a tear, it causes a tear, that in one's heart or in one's soul. Any event or experience, direct or indirect, that induces a stress reaction. Now, we often talk about the different types of trauma. We talk about acute, we talk about chronic and complex. Acute is a one-time kind of incident. Chronic is a series of incidents that bring about those kinds of feelings and stress responses. And then there's complex, which is when the person is still in the midst of experiencing trauma, right? So a lot of times the kids I work with, or if we can certainly talk about our own spaces and the fact that we keep hearing trauma stories and we continue to be in the midst of trauma, right? Because it's happening around us and people are sharing that trauma, all right? It doesn't have to have, we can buffer it and we can find ways to address it as it's going. But one of the things that I talk to a lot of I try to help our staff and other therapists understand is that like when kids are in complex trauma, this is not a time when we can heal. This is not a healing point for children. If they're still experiencing some sort of level of stress in their lives, they're not prepared to heal because they still have to cope. They have to cope with going back into their families. They have to deal with their ongoing experiences of continuing to maintain whatever they can to stay alive in a lot of these kids' lives. So they our kind of work needs to be kind of readjusted in terms of, as therapists, need to kind of understand that if they're in complex trauma, our goal is primarily to help those children cope, regulate, and which helps to build resilience, okay? Because resilience will help them get through it at the point at which they will be ready for healing, all right? So being able to understand and have our own expectations about our own work is an important thing here so that we don't overstress ourselves as well in terms of trying to force a child or trying to force an adult even into healing when that really is not going to be a helpful thing for them. But that's what complex trauma is about being around it and being still experiencing it. Whereas trauma and trauma context makes a difference. When trauma happens to somebody because it's a one-time incident, it's some sort of flood, or it's a tornado, or it's a hurricane, or it's some sort of disaster, natural disaster, that context of what happened there, and because oftentimes those are more acute, it doesn't take away the negative impact any less of that trauma. But what it does is that oftentimes people can resolve it in a little quicker way by considering, oh, this was a natural act. This wasn't something that I had no control over, and nobody has any control over. The more difficult cases are those traumas that people experience when they experience them at the hands of people, right? Because when adults experience trauma at the hands of people, it's harder for them to kind of reconcile. How can a person treat somebody like that, right? It's harder to reconcile than a natural disaster. So context makes a difference. And then there's this other breakdown we need to have about stress, good stress and bad stress. Good stress is controlled, paced, and planned, all right? So please remember these three terms, because when we're talking about being in the midst of complex trauma, like we are, because we hear stories over and over again, we can still control, we can still plan, and we can still pace the trauma that's coming in our jobs, okay? So there's a level of those pieces that we can still do. Whereas bad stress is when it becomes random, irregular, and uncontrolled, all right? And bad stress essentially equals trauma, all right? So what good stress does, when I get on that elliptical machine and I get out, I'm ready to, get my heart pumping and get it going, it helps me to be on my game. It helps us to be ready. It helps us to be present and alert. And exercise the system to strengthen the system and strengthen the heart, right? So it's planned, paced, and controlled. Whereas with bad stress, it has the result of causing hypervigilance, dysregulation, distractibility, reduced hope for the future, risk of inappropriate and self-defeating coping reactions. Okay, so some of those results of bad stress you might be able to read into, when we talk about burnout or when we talk about compassion fatigue, which are some other terms that we use when we talk about trauma, secondary trauma. Good stress, bad stress, And then and also, by the way, bad stress or trauma, which equals trauma, is often talked about in three other terms, which is episodic, one event, chronic, again, ongoing, and or multiple events, and then toxic, which is environmental, when the whole environment just is stressful, totally stressful, and can feel overwhelming, right? So secondary trauma, again, has multiple different ways of defining it. I found secondary traumatic stress refers to the presence of PTSD symptoms caused by at least one exposure to a traumatic material. The top one here is trauma resulting from caring for, hearing about, or witnessing the intense suffering of others. Over time, the cumulative effect can result in internalization of trauma, leading to compassion, fatigue, or burnout, right? And those are some of the other, at the bottom there, those are some of the other words or phrases that are often referred to along with secondary trauma. And some definitions here that I provide in terms of what compassion fatigue is. Again, these are words that are interchangeably used with secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. Secondary trauma and vicarious trauma does not mean it's less or worse or less important, even the opposite. But it does simply indicate more of the position of the person who's experienced the trauma. So it's one person out, or it's two people out in terms of experiencing trauma, vicarious or secondary trauma. There's a continuum that I think is helpful to understand, where it's the primary trauma is the one that happens to the direct victim. The secondary trauma is experienced by maybe other family members in the area, and people that were present or around or with that person, or first responders after a trauma has occurred. And then compassion fatigue is more of what we were talking about today about secondary trauma, about how it affects us as those kind of next ring removed kind of people from the direct trauma itself. And that can bring that's that secondary trauma, and that can bring about that burnout to an extent that it really affects what we do in our jobs. The other one that doesn't get talked about much is organizational trauma. You know, although I know that I've experienced it over the years in different places that I've worked, right? None of you have to shake your heads on this one, but just in terms of telling yourself, you know, if I could just work with my clients, that would be just so great. If I didn't have to deal with the other stuff that's going on in the office and deal with the other this and that, you know, that's the organizational piece that sometimes we don't talk about a lot. Oh, yeah, right? It has a visceral reaction right from there, right? Absolutely. So being mindful that absolutely that is a part, that can be a part of secondary trauma as well. All right? Being mindful about how to take care of yourself in those moments of experiencing those things. Exposure to bad stress. This is about what causes it. ACEs. How many have heard of the ACEs? Oh, good. Okay, so when it comes to secondary trauma, okay, knowing what is your ACEs score, your adverse childhood experiences score, the number out of 10 that you may have experiences that you may have had that may influence. It may have influenced you, may influence you. Some of those times, some of those experiences, and those are the reasons we get into this, right? Because of those bad experiences when we were young, you know? A lot of us, therapists have this kind of fantasy of, I'll help those people the way that I was, so that they're not feeling it the way that I felt it, kind of thing. And that's all good and well. But it's important to know that is one of those motivations. And it's not a bad motivation. It just is an awareness that we need to have, a self-awareness that's where that feeling comes from. But that we recognize that those experiences have had some sort of effect on us, those ACEs. Multiple factor theory, it's just saying that there's many different reasons why people, or how, and the causes of violence, that it's not just one thing, right? There are many different things that cause traumas. Again, we ask what's wrong with the person, and the bigger question, which you can't see there, is what happened to this person, right? This is the investigation that we need to really come to. The real result of experiences of trauma result in this immediate set of things, emotionally and physically, in terms of how we react. And then there's this delayed trauma stress reactions that often happen that are important to pay attention to, because these are the ones that I recognize that when I'm at that place of feeling this compassion fatigue, maybe even this close to a moment of burnout, that these are some of the things that are probably happening to me in this moment, right? All right, and that we need to pay attention to. A little later on, you'll see there's a quiz that I found that I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And you can add up the points, and you can kind of say, oh boy, this is an area that I need to really get some help with. But we'll get there in a few minutes. Brain physiology. Hopefully, I know this is a 2-day presentation, okay? And I've got 120 slides. No, I've only got 67 slides or something like that. But usually I pack in way too many slides. But it's really important that we understand the functioning of this, that we have the knowledge of what's going on within our brain in order to use and to capitalize on the tools that we need to use, all right? So knowing that the brain physiology and understanding this whole piece, it's just an important part. Understanding that the brain, it develops and it functions and it processes from the bottom up, right? All right, the bottom being the brainstem, and the top being this neocortex, this wrinkly kind of wormy kind of thing on top. That is where all the major processing of, balancing out. Should I do this or should I do that? What's in my best interest? What's going on? How I'd like to dream a little bit about how to get in a positive space. All that kind of processing happens up here, but it doesn't get up there if we're stuck in our brain in this limbic system, if the emotional part, and this is true about, we can transfer this to kids' experience too, because they're functioning in this midbrain a lot by being stuck, and they're in this spin cycle. And it doesn't get to the top part of the processing brain, because they're stuck in this midbrain. And we get stuck sometimes in this emotional midbrain part. As a result, when it gets stuck in that midbrain, okay, this little almond-shaped brain set of cells, the amygdala, releases cortisol, which is the stress drug or stress chemical, and that cortisol sends out the signal to the rest of the body: survive. And as a result, then the body and the other parts of the body have to go into this mode and have to go do some sort of reaction to cope with this particular message, right? And so there's 5 Fs. I use 5 Fs. Some people only have 4. Some people only start or just go with the fight and flight piece. People have heard of fight and flight before? With me on that, right? Yep, okay, pretty commonly understood, right? There's freeze, where some people, where they get in the stress mode, and we may have experienced it, where we're just so stressed, we're at that place, we become immobile. We just can't move, right? Another reaction we might have is to fold. This is where we just turn over on our backs and just say, okay, we let it happen. We just take it, and we try to absorb it. But what happens is this is the place at which many of us, and many people, and kids, will disassociate. This is where the brain just can't handle the stress, and so it has to remove itself, almost physically remove itself from what's going on, from the stress inside. And so disassociation happens here. And by the way, disassociation is not a bad thing. Disassociation is a very positive and a good coping skill to be able to handle stress, all right? In fact, many of you have disassociated with me even today, okay? And I'm okay with that, all right? Okay? It's that looking at your watch, it's that, checking out, kind of thinking, okay, how much more time is he going to talk? What's he going to do? But that's a disassociation that helps you to cope, because sometimes it's hard to focus on a particular issue or a particular thing at any given time. And then there's flock. Flock is one that hasn't gotten much attention over the years, but this is one of those tools that I'm going to come back to in terms of what is important for us to do when we are experiencing our own understanding. We're having some trauma reactions, all right? Flocking is if somebody ran in here and shouted obscenities, and then, although I don't think they can slam that door, but they'd shut the door and run out. One of the first things we would all do is we kind of look at each other. Did you just see? We're connecting. We're flocking. This goes back thousands and thousands of years. Because in order to survive as a species, we had to be in groups. We had to be connected with other people in order to survive. And so it has become part of that internal, that instinctual part of our response, reaction to stress, is to connect. And as people, that's what has helped us to survive as a species, is to connect. And so connecting, when fight, flight, and freeze, fold, and flock happen, the initial release of the cortisol is happening. But when we connect, there's a different chemical that gets released, and that's called oxytocin. Oxytocin is most released when at times of lactation and breastfeeding. It's it's a chemical that when it's released, you feel calm, you feel peace, you feel safe and secure. This is one of those things that we haven't talked about much. I mean, it's really just come about more in the past 10, 15 years that we've really been able to identify that oxytocin has really been an active agent and an answer, if not, to be able to understand how do we counterbalance this cortisol? How do we help so that stress hormone gets counterbalanced? The antidote, if you will, to cortisol. And here it is. Here it is, oxytocin. There's some research right now I've been seeing, and I'm not proposing this for anybody, but they're talking about nasal sprays with oxytocin, right? To counterbalance the cortisol release, okay? Nonetheless, what we can do naturally, though, is release more oxytocin to our brain by way of certain things that we can do. When we connect, when we strategically connect with somebody else, we can help for those cortisol. By the way, men have oxytocin as well. And we can strategically use that release of oxytocin by way of connecting with other people, right? So knowing this, and so it goes back to what we started out with in terms of sharing things with each other, sharing pieces of information with each other, about making a connection. When you make a connection, you're helping oxytocin to get released with somebody else. Now, there are different ways to release that oxytocin, of course, by connecting. There's the way of, the quickest way is and some of the more effective ways of oxytocin being released is by gentle, warm, appropriate, mutual touch. That's why it's called the attachment chemical, because during lactation, there's touch by the child, touch by the mom, and that the oxytocin is flowing in both places. And there's that sense of calm and peace, and attachment happens. So being able to have that happen comes by way of appropriate, warm, mutual, accepting touch, acceptance of touch. A second level is by having a connection, by like having an interaction, you don't have to talk about how you're feeling. You don't have to talk about the issue or the trauma that you're dealing with. All you're doing is connecting with somebody that you feel safe and secure with, right? Non-judged by, okay? Having that kind of connection helps to release oxytocin. Another way to release oxytocin is by being in proximity to somebody that you feel safe and secure by. All right? By just being in proximity. You don't even have to talk about anything, right? Just by having a sense of somebody who you feel is connected to you, you feel some sort of element that kind of ties you together, that sense of connection helps to release oxytocin. Another level of release of oxytocin has to do with dogs or cats. I don't know that they've done any research with chameleons or with other kinds of non-furry pets, but with dogs and cats, when there's a presence and there seems to be a connection. And this is something, and I think, Renee, we kind of talked about this earlier, that when she brings her dog into the space where other professionals are, they're just drawn to it, right? They're just drawn to that connection with the dog. And making a connection helps to release oxytocin. Then kind of the last level of releasing oxytocin happens during meditation and prayer. Because there's a sense of connection with a higher being or with Mother Nature or with something else out there, right? A connection. So, again, what's the antidote to cortisol? Oxytocin. How do we get it to flow? By connecting. And so when we're freaking out, when we're like kind of, or we're spinning, we need to understand, okay, how do I get back regulated? A best way to get back regulated is one of those areas to get the oxytocin flowing, right? Okay? It's true with kids too. You have a kid who's freaking out, all right? And again, I talk a lot with parents about this, is that what we know now, one of the probably, even though it's certainly an acceptable way of, when you give a kid a timeout, go, do your thing and come back when you're ready to talk. Remember, stress and trauma cause isolation, a sense of isolation and being alone. So when we tell kids to go be alone when you're stressed, that's a tough message for them, because they're already feeling alone and stressed, right? And so being alone more, and particularly for kids who are in complex trauma or who have been experienced chronic stress, their being alone might be even worse to them than something else. Now, if they're if they're freaking out, or you're freaking out and you just can't get it together, remember the different levels of getting the oxytocin released. You don't have to have somebody put their arm around you. You don't have, some people just don't want people to touch them, which is fine. But it's about not being alone and helping that child, helping that other person who's freaking out, helping ourselves who might be having some really in the moment kind of experience, to be able to know, how do I connect them? Okay, who do I need to be with, just to be present with? I don't need to talk about it, or I don't need to say all the deep, dark secrets in my life or anything, or any of the traumas that have happened before. All I need to do is to pay attention to being present for the moment with somebody that I feel safe and secure with. Right? Get that oxytocin released. That's more about the cortisol and the oxytocin. And then more about what happens around the trauma and the other implications that are there. We talk, in here in the information that you'll get on the slides is information about the ACEs, and hopefully, there was a good share of people that are familiar with the ACEs, so you have some understanding of that. Anyone with an ACEs score of 6 or higher, without it getting addressed sometime in their life, it's likely has a 20-year shortened lifespan. That's why this ACEs is important to know, not just for other people, but for ourselves, right? And that if that number is, it's likely, all right, that because of all the health problems that result as far as experiencing those traumas or those adverse experiences, that those health problems will likely develop later on that end up that way. Okay. Oh, that's the wrong button. Okay. And then it has some different outcomes as well. And there's some interesting areas, I believe, that are missing from were missed from the ACEs that I include here, but that things now, a lot of people are looking into more of these other parts besides just the 10 areas of adverse experiences. We're looking into many more other types of adverse experiences besides those 10. And so there's some pieces that are important to pay attention to there. Understanding attachment as well as community and historical trauma are all parts of those things. So here's that quiz. It's hard to read, I know. But it has a number of series of questions in here or statements in here, and how you would rate yourself on these, and then you can add them up and look at, whether you're in the area of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, and when you add them up, or if you're in the area of job burnout, that might be helpful to kind of get a copy of when you look at these slides, to be able to go through for yourselves, all right, to be able to identify it. Also, there's a chart on here about what to do before you're experiencing some sort of trauma in the when you're working along. If you're preparing, and again, if it's planned, if it's controlled, and if it's paced, right? If we know coming in during the beginning of the day, okay, I've got 8 clients I got to see today, and I know at least 7 of them are going to be pretty tough. All right, I'm preparing, right? I'm kind of in control of what's going on. So so what I can do before I experience some sort of secondary trauma, what I can do during that time when I'm hearing the stories, and then later, and then right after, or right after and then later, what I can do for myself. So there's some information here about that. And I've only got a couple minutes here. So the epic moments that I wanted to have you kind of finish off with is really about having a tool to pay attention to how do you take care of one of the ways to take care of yourself. Taking care of yourself, there are two pieces here, is about engaging in compassion, as well as looking at this energy, passion, inspiration connections. Okay, I'm almost done. Engaging in compassion. It's about bringing to mind, okay? One of the things, just like meditation and prayer, one of the ways of getting oxytocin to flow is by thinking about a person that you feel connected with. Somebody that you have a positive experience with, somebody that you feel safe and secure with. So you don't even have to be in their presence for oxytocin to come about. If you have in your mind an understanding or an experience with somebody that has felt that they cared for you, that they've shown some sort of compassion for you. I had a dentist once, and I didn't go to the dentist for many years. When I got my first real job, I finally got dental insurance, and I went. And the first day I was in that chair, the dentist, a wonderful dentist, she said, "Dave, we got to pull this tooth." And I said, "Oh my gosh, okay, you got to do it, go for it." So she was working on this tooth and couldn't pull out this part of the tooth, and she was working on it. It seemed like hours, but it was probably only about 5 or 10 minutes. And I was in pain. I was screaming. I was like, this was terrible. And she was pumping in Novocaine like there was no tomorrow, right? And things were, this was terrible. But then she stopped. She pushed the tray away. She sat me up. And she put her arm on my shoulder and she said, "Dave, are you okay?" No dentist had ever asked me that before, right? And it was that moment that I felt, oh my gosh, she cares. She cares. And she said, "Dave, maybe I need to send you to an oral surgeon." And I said, "How long will that take?" She said, "Probably about 3 weeks." I said, no, do it now. She went back to it. It was no less painful. She went back to it. She finally got it out. It was an abscess tooth, and it was all ugly and all that stuff. But it was no less painful during that time. But by her showing me some compassion, I was able to balance out getting through that situation, right? So you need to find your compassion. You need to find your dentist moment, okay? You need to find your moment where you felt that compassion, where you felt that place that you can bring back to mind how you can balance out what's been going on for you. And then to understand what epic moments are is to understand your energy. Where do you get your energy? Where do you get your passion? Where do you get your inspiration? And what kind of connections do you have that you can bring back to mind as a tool to be able to do that? And so in the slides, it gives you an opportunity to list out the pieces that are all parts of those 4 things. All right? So, other resources are on that slide too, some videos to watch, some things to understand about ACEs, and hopefully some other resources. There's a book, by the way, it's called Trauma Stewardship, that I would really recommend, particularly for professionals who work in fields of helping people. It's a tremendous book that identifies a lot of the 16 things to watch out for, 16 or more. And then some specific steps to actually take, some elements of what I've said in terms of mindfulness and some other pieces to help you through that process. Thank you. I know my time's up, so I appreciate you being here. Y'all are, I appreciate your time that you took to be here today. Thank you. Yeah. Beautiful. Yep.
So next up, we want to give you guys an example of an agency that is bringing these resources to their staff, so you can see the different options that you might have in your workplaces. Today we have with us two representatives from Alina EMS. We have Joan Meller, who is the Director of External Affairs, and Renee Rosenberg, who is the Emergency Medical Services Operations Supervisor with Alina, and they brought a nice little pal with them, Evie, and you'll get to know Evie as well. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So thanks, Courtney. And thank you, Dave. That was really a wonderful presentation. And what we'd like to do is just take a few minutes with you and talk about really what we're doing at Alina Health to bring to life some of the things that you've talked about and what we've done. And we're just starting, but just to give you a sense of what a large EMS organization is doing around this topic. And I don't think it's much different for other public safety areas. And so we started back in January, February, and we started looking at the research and what's going on around the research topics of burnout, stress. We did our own research and found out about 20% of our 600 medics do experience burnout. Some of the other research recently that we've been looking at is that suicide among EMTs is about threefold that of the general population. Public safety in general, there's still research studies going on, but it's anywhere from twofold up to tenfold depending on the study and location. So we know this is a really big issue. And Alina Health is, just to back up for a second, Alina Health is a large organization that encompasses 14 hospitals, 90 clinics, hospice, home care, and EMS. And EMS is a large organization. It's 600 frontline employees. And then we've got, of course, our leadership and staff that support our people on the front line. We've got bases here in Mounds View. We have that's for all of North Metro. We respond mostly in the North Metro to Anoka County as our largest service area. So we have all of the cities in Anoka County. We have South Metro is Savage, so we have most of Scott County is where we serve there. And then the Western Corridor with Hutchinson, Glencoe, New Ulm, St. Peter, along the western corridor of the greater Twin Cities. So that's our response area, and our 600 medics, gosh, we've been in business for 75 years next year. So it's really been a great organization to have in the Twin Cities and to serve. When someone picks up 911, we're the ones who come. And we have our own 911 dispatch center that brings all of the citizens of our response areas the pre-arrival instructions. And so anywhere from they're going to tell you how to do CPR if it's a cardiac arrest to, also, working on any kind of trauma or any kind of issue with you as you're dealing with it. And so we have, our front line is including all of our dispatchers. And so when I joined a couple years ago and took a look at the organization and working on government affairs, community affairs, one of the things I noticed in talking with public safety and with our own folks is this whole idea of wellness. And that well-being is so important, and what are we doing? And we were doing some things, but it wasn't intentional enough, according to what the research said. So we started to really take a deeper dive on it. We created a wellness, we call it Employee Well-Being Council. And this represents self-selected immediately 15, 20 people from the field to help develop what is needed for the well-being of our employees. And so our biggest champion and leader is Supervisor Renee Rosenberg. She has just been our torchbearer in really bringing forward ideas that we know work based on research. We've got another handful of people that are really coming together to say, what is going to work for our people? And so with the provider at the center, we created circles around and looked at existing resources. So employee assistance program is a big circle because it's a vertical system. Within Alina, we can use our employee assistance program and get 5 sessions of therapy for free. And so we just need to provide awareness around that. So if your organizations have anything like that, it's a lot about just getting our frontline aware of that resource. Then we wanted to do suicide training, so we did a whole series of classes for leaders. It was a 2-day course to teach the leaders how to recognize signs and symptoms of potential suicide, and then what to do about it. And then we did what's called Safe Talk classes, and those are for all of the frontline employees to learn how to recognize in myself and others signs of suicide, potential, just the awareness of what leads up to suicide and what can I do to prevent that in myself and my partner. Then another circle is standard operating procedures around if an employee has a mental health crisis. What do we do as leaders? How do we help them? And then we have now a standard operating procedure around traumatic calls, or what we call critical incidents. And Renee is working on that, and with me on some of the other standard operating procedures around wellness, so that everyone is crystal clear what to do for any kind of mental health situation amongst employees. So the whole focus is on that employee. The dog therapy program was started by Renee, and she'll get into that. And that has just been a super big success. We're piloting it with Evie, but hope to potentially grow it if that's something that is positive. And it is. I mean, it's working. And one quick thing to mention about the dog therapy program is, how do you know it's been successful? So we're going to look at how to do a research study to show before and after using the dog, and maybe there's some cool technologies out there, heart math, where you put a little something behind a medic's ear before and after, and you can actually test stress levels, things like that. And so anyway, those are kind of some of the main themes. And the other big piece right now that Renee's working on with the team is resiliency. And how do we look at all of these ideas Dave was talking about, and we're looking at, for us, this idea of balance, counterbalance, and what are some of the things that we can do to counterbalance what we're dealing with every day in the field. And so some of those things and Renee could talk about specifics that work for you and your folks, but some of the things that they were telling all of us, it is really the universe. I think you're right. But when you leave your workplace to go home and have that transition time, do what works for you. So if it's a gratefulness journal in your car, just write 5 things that you're grateful for every day after you leave, but before you get home. You go home and maybe there's a place for prayer or meditation. Maybe there's a candle you light. But there's always an intentional transition time between work life and home life. And whatever that is for you, build it into your life, and then do the things that you're suggesting around reflecting on every moment that brings you some sort of trauma, and working through the connections at work or at home that work for you. And so I'm starting these things. I think it's for everybody. I agree that this is really, I think, for all of us. So I'm going to leave it there and let Renee take over and talk about some of the things at the really ground level. From an organizational level, we're putting in, intention, resources, and dollars around this, because we see that this is really important for our people and for their well-being.
I don't want Evie to have to get up, take a couple of steps.
There you go.
So Dave's talk was awesome. And what Joan said, Alina Health EMS responds to 300 emergencies a day. So we have 300 opportunities for secondary trauma of our employees every day, just like you guys do in your daily work. So last fall, we thought it would be cool to get a dog at our base. And that's what I thought it was. And after I had an employee who was on light duty who was a few months pregnant, she kept tipping over, so we couldn't put her on the ambulance. So it just happened to be that her father is a teacher, and he has a therapy dog that he brings to school with him every day for his students. And she had a psychology degree from Bethel. So we kept peeling back layers of an onion in the search for getting a therapy dog. Is this something for us? And it just kind of blossomed, and Joan created the Wellbeing Council, and now the thought of just having a dog at the base is now, how can we help our first responders? So Evie's been with us since March. We purchased her. Alina Health, I joke that I was able to get a $4 billion healthcare company to buy our department a dog. So we got her in March from a local breeder. We had a lot of support from the breeder. She is a nurse at Children's. So when I talked to her and said, this is what we want to do, some of the breeders were like, yeah, well, we have this litter and this litter. But Heather was like, oh, this is so wonderful. Yes, you know, as the breeder, I get the pick of the litter. And I want to help you with that. So we went to the top of a 60-person waiting list. And she helped us choose the dog that's chewing on her leash right now. But like Joan said, she's been quite a blessing for us. She rides with myself and another handler. We're operations supervisors, so if you see the little SUVs with the line of health on them, she could be in the back. And when we're on duty, we meet up with crews at hospitals. We meet up with them at their base. They may play fetch with her. At the end of her shift, we try to keep her around during shift change time because sometimes people just want to take a time out. And what we have found, and this was from one of our employees who was not really sure if this dog thing was an idea, but after having her for a week, he went out, he had a bad day. They had a rough shift, they were getting off late, and he spent some time with her and then emailed our leadership and said, you know, when I went home, I wasn't thinking about my day at work, I was thinking about I just played with the dog. So that's kind of an anecdotal instance of why something like this is good. So like Dave said, they release oxytocin, it's science. You know, I'm sure all of you just look at her and you're like, ah. So we've used, our intent is to use her when diffusing crews, just to bring a sense of calm, or a word I learned recently, equanimity, and it is just an overall sense of calm. And like Dave and Joan were talking on how we can do that, there's a lot of opportunities to create calm in your life. Just taking 5 minutes and using your Apple Watch and do a breathing exercise. Meditation, just making sure that equanimity is your focus in your life, because we do have stressful days. So just to kind of quickly end with a story, because I think there's probably time for questions. Last week, and I apologize, I kind of sound a bit nasally, I went to Seattle with 2 of my peers, and we went on a retreat for first responders. It was called a Warrior Rescuer Retreat. She keeps chewing. And it wasn't necessarily science-based on how we respond to our employees who have experienced this secondary trauma, but the focus was more on us having the tools so that we can help others. And talking about transitions, we had a part of the class was we had a representation of a rock and a shell. So in my uniform and in our uniforms, we have a certain archetype. We're probably a little harder. We're business, type A, let's get this done. That's our work archetype. But when we go home, we need to be a different person. So the rock represents our archetype at work, but the shell represents the archetype that we need to move to when we're at home. And the difference between a rock and a shell is a rock you can throw on the ground, nothing's going to happen to it. But if you throw the shell on the ground, it's going to shatter. So you need to take better care of your shell, which is outside work, than your rock. So that's basically all I have. If anybody has any questions, we're more than welcome to answer them. Evie has an Instagram page. You can follow her at Alina EMS Therapy Dog and see how she takes care of our employees every day.
Now, if you have any questions for Dave or Joan or Renee, feel free to go ahead and ask.
So Dave, in your presentation, you're talking about the brain's capacity to keep making connections and when that ends.
Yeah.
Does that switch when the population, or does it switch for the population that has developmental disabilities or impairments?
Yeah, I don't think we're sophisticated enough to know fully exactly how that works for developmental disabilities folks, because there's much more complexity going on with the development of their brains that's happening. Nonetheless, I think that being able to tap into that kind of helping to make a connection
can still be a breakthrough in terms of helping them in those moments when they are experiencing kind of that overload.
Can I, when you answer the questions, can you step closer to the mics because we're recording and
Yes.
the way it looks?
Yes, will do.
Any other questions?
I love that Alana's putting like organizational capacity behind supporting employees. Do you have any advice in how to kind of make the argument to your organization to say, look, this is a place that you need to invest in? Because I find that a lot of times we talk about self-care, but the burden gets put on the employees to do that as additional work outside of work. And so that's like, kind of like, how do you kind of say, like, this has to be part of work time?
So Alina, it being a large organization, is very driven by numbers and research. So when you look at just your turnover of your organization, that's a big one, because the time it takes to train an employee, you know, we look at it costs us $50,000 to put an EMT on the street. And if that employee is having issues or doesn't make it through because the job is hard, that's a loss. So that's one thing that I can know of immediately.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of research studies out there now to show that public safety organizations need this for retention and for, like Renee said, just to even hire people, to let them know that this is a value add. And I think that's a big reason that our leadership is saying, yes, this is important, we have to do it. And then looking at the fact that, you know, you've got workman's comp and you've got all these other things you can actually look at. There are studies now to show the cost of things compared to the cost of implementing these programs. That can be very cost effective. We're doing our best to be very cost effective. So there are, I think the best way to do it in organizations in public safety is with the numbers.
Mine might be a little bit more off topic, but how did you look into like a breeding for a therapy dog, or like what was the process of looking into that?
There is an ambulance, the largest ambulance in the company is AMR, or now called Global Medical Response. They have 22 therapy dogs. They started a little over a year ago. And so we kind of relied on them, but pretty simple. We wear blue pants, so having dog hair on our pants is not nice. But also, people that have have allergies or have issues with dog hair, the dander at the end of the dog hair is what causes the sneezing and whatnot. So we chose a dog that does not shed. She has to get her hair cut every 4 months. And as you can see, she's kind of due. But she doesn't shed at all. So that was kind of the big thing, is we didn't want dog hair all over our bases and our ambulances. And with the Golden Doodle, she's pretty smart. Poodles are considered some of the smartest dogs out there. And with the Golden Retriever part of it, she's athletic. So I say we have 160 dog walkers at work. So they take her out and play ball. We must have a dozen tennis balls all over the place. And she's pretty driven by that. So she's not like a lap dog. She's pretty athletic.
Just out of curiosity, with now, like, I know that a lot of organizations are allowing you to bring dogs or pets to work or stuff. Since Phoebe is technically owned by your organization, and I don't know, I'm sorry if I didn't hear it, but who does she stay with mainly does she stay at the organization, or does she have a specific, like, where she can go and rest at somebody's house, or kind of have even her moment of, I need this break in the.
So right now, since she's only 9 months old, so she lives with another handler and also myself. The other night I worked until 2 a.m. and he was on at 6. So we have a place for her to sleep at the base. So we put her to bed at 10 o'clock and then gave the night crews an opportunity if they wanted, you know, of course they kept her up all night. But when she gets older, we're going to keep her at the base more, but she still has to be a dog, because you don't want them to not have that opportunity to be a dog. And she's grown, myself and the other handler, we each have 2 dogs. So she's got a little pack mentality when it comes to that. So, and our dogs are only gonna be with leadership. You know, we have a large union organization, so our employees are not required to take her out. They don't have to clean up after her. That's strictly what leadership takes care of her.
And also just to say that at the system level, you know, Alina is a large system. And so what we did was put this all together in a big document, and we vetted it with legal and compliance as well to make sure that you're, you know, following all the steps with whatever organization departments need to get in your areas, whoever needs to be in that approval process, especially for around risk and compliance.
In the
That's
liability
important.
part of it, by having a dog that is certified as a therapy dog, that kind of helps with you saying, okay, we've done everything we can to make sure we have a dog that is not gonna bite somebody. Come here, Evie.
But we do have, for example, we have a person in one of our bases that's allergic to dog saliva. So we just make special efforts wherever we bring this dog, that people understand, okay, so the dog doesn't get to go in that area. The dog can only be in, and some people don't like dogs. Some people, there are cultural reasons why people don't like dogs. So we try to find where those are and then work around that and be super respectful of whoever is around the dog for that day.
Any other questions? All right, I think you each got Val card here, if you take just a minute to fill that out, and then Ellen's at the back door, she'll collect them from you. Your feedback is helpful as we plan future events. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good girl.
Do you have any cards? I don't. Oh, okay, did we already ask you? We just love your style.
Yeah.